yourself. It could be any time. It could be here in a worship service, or it could be at home, or at a sporting event, or out on a hike. Just bring to mind a time that you would like to reflect on, that you felt connected to something greater than yourself. And as you are remembering that time, I wonder what helped you feel that sense of connection. Consider the environment you were in, the space, the place, what your senses were experiencing. Consider the timing. Was it morning, night? Was it a special occasion? Consider who you were with. Were you alone? Were you with family and friends? Were you with strangers, a huge crowd? And with all of these thoughts on this time of connection to something greater than yourself, I invite you to bring those memories back into this space where we are together, and we'll invite some responses. What was it about this experience that helped you feel connected to something greater than yourself? If you're online and you would like to post it in the chat, that's fine. Or if you'd like to share out loud, I'll bring the microphone around to you, but we'd love just a few responses. What is it that helped you feel connected to something greater than yourself? Anyone?
It was the first Christmas my mom had without Dad. It was Christmas morning. I went to pick her up, and the sun was coming across the bay. We were facing east, and there was a golden pathway. It was a little miracle of nature and being together on a difficult but beautiful, incredibly beautiful morning.
Thank you, Celia. Anyone else would like to share? We've got one in the chat, or a person who'd like to share online, Carbon. Two in the chat. Music, nature, chanting. And nature, special people, and music. Thank you. Yes, nature. And another here.
Two things I can remember. One was on our way to a concert at Symphony Hall in Boston. We passed the Mother Church of Christian Science, a religion I don't ascribe to, although Mary Baker Eddy was certainly inspired. And the door was open, the service had just let out. There was an usher, kind of standing guard. I went over to him and I said, "Can I just take a peek in?" He said, "Sure. Just be quiet and take 5 minutes." And I walked in and I was almost knocked over by the feeling of spirit in that place. The congregation had just left and their spirit was still there. I was raised a Baha'i, and I knew one of the hands of the cause, a kind of a latter-day holy man in the Baha'i faith. I knew his sons and been to summer camp with his sons and him. And then months later, I saw him at an event, and he hugged me. And I felt an incredible, painless electric shock go through my body, and people said my eyes lit up. So he was imbued with the spirit that I think we're talking about constantly in church.
Thank you, Frank, for both those memories. And I see a couple more in the chat. Woody says, for me, it has primarily to do with choosing to be present to the unfathomable in all of my experience. And Elizabeth shares, ocean and mountain walks and sitting, music, concert in the pit with a friend feeling connected to thousands of people. Thank you all. We'll stop there, but if you have more thoughts, I'm happy to hear them later, but we'll move on with the forum.
So why do we do this thing that we do on Sunday mornings that we call worship? Well, a short answer would be to evoke what you all just described, right? That sense of something that is beyond us. And how I tend to think about it is what you heard in the sermon this morning. It's an intentional practice. It's a spiritual practice of worship, a communal spiritual practice, where we seek to connect to that which is within, that which is among, and that which is beyond. And so what we do in worship is we intentionally step outside of our normal routine, whatever that might be, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. And we set aside time and turn our attention to, let me breathe a minute and see what's within. And we, come together online or in person. And it offers the opportunity to connect with something greater. And when I say something greater, I don't necessarily mean God or spirit. Some people experience it that way. That something greater could be finding meaning in justice work. It could be finding meaning in connection with others. There's lots of ways that beyond could be experienced and described. So what we do on Sunday morning is set aside that time. I see worship as an opportunity for inspiration, to get filled up again, to go back out into the world. It's also an opportunity for transformation. Something inside us can shift. It's always wonderful. It does a preacher's heart good when someone on their way out says, I felt this shift in me, whether it was in my heart or in my brain, because to me that's the transformation that we can open ourselves up to when we gather on Sunday morning. There's a couple other things that we do in worship. We can share about and learn how to live our values, and particularly our Unitarian Universalist values, since we're a UU congregation. And we also honor rites of passage and transitions. So this morning, we lit a candle for an elder who died, and that was a transition for that family and for this community as we say goodbye. And we welcomed new members. That's another transition and rite of passage, if you will, in welcoming those who joined our community. And we do that in worship because we are saying this is something special. This is something that we want to hold up of value. And so where I go back to around the word of worship is that it's the ancient English root of the word worship. It can be translated into considering things of worth. So what we do on Sunday is we hold up that which we value. We hold up connection. We hold up grief and mourning and saying goodbye. We hold up welcome. We hold up setting aside time to connect with the holy and sacred, however we might describe that. And what's important, I think, is that meaningful worship drives the health of the congregation. It's the time when we come together as a community. And from my perspective, from my experience, it's the time when I minister to the whole community together. And there are other times when I might do that in a memorial service or a celebration of life or something, but every Sunday it's an opportunity for us to gather to hold up that which is of worth and minister to each other. So that's what I think is the purpose of worship and why we gather. I'll say a little bit about our history and, and those kinds of things, but I think that's a good summary for now. And if you have any questions about that, hang on to them. I'm happy to have more discussion. So now let's talk about how things have shifted over time.
Yeah, so the practice of worship is shifting and has shifted, and part of it's generational. We say that we're a multi-generational community when we welcome people during worship here on Sunday mornings. And in fact, churches in general are one of the most multi-generational spaces in our society, where we have the largest spread of folks of many generations coming together for one activity. And some of the obvious ways that we've been talking about generational shifts in worship for a long time, music comes to mind. How many churches, congregations, and other faith communities have had many, many debates over the years about different styles of music coming along. And as you're probably aware, different generations prefer different styles of music. So this is not new. In fact, Pete Seeger was bringing new worship music in that time, and now if we play Pete Seeger, that's old music. So this is not a new phenomenon. But other generational shifts also really affect the life of our congregation together. A massive shift in generational and demographic life has happened around family structures and time and how it is preserved on Sunday for church. So with younger generations, we see more families that are either doing custody shifts where the kids are not with the parent who comes to church every weekend. It's quite common for it to be every other weekend. So even if that family came to OUC every weekend when they were together, it would still be every other week for that family with a custody arrangement. And that's something that we didn't used to think about when we structured and scheduled Sundays. Another shift is that the rest of our society has become increasingly more secular, and more things get scheduled on Sundays than church, and that's just a new change. Also, more people who come to OUC and other congregations besides OUC now are coming having been unchurched. So where it used to be that folks came into Unitarian Universalism from another faith tradition, one where they may have had the same habits and behaviors of worship, but they're just shifting their theology and their membership. Now, increasingly, people arrive having been unchurched as children, youth, or into their adulthood, meaning they don't have any habits of church attendance or worship. And so it's all new, and it's all something that they're searching for, but they don't have a preconceived notion of. And then the most recent thing I would like to bring up is studies have been looking at people's so specifically just churched people, so people who were in the habit of going to church pre-COVID. Studies have asked, post-COVID, or whatever this, whether we're truly post-COVID, we can debate that later. But now, whatever now is, do you prefer in-person, online, or a bit of both? And the only generation where the majority say they prefer in person are the baby boomers. Every other generation younger than that, the majority, even Gen X, say online or a combo. And for millennials and Gen Z, it's a large majority that say online or a combo. So this is going to affect worship moving forward. If the younger generations like having online worship, that's where it's going to go in the future. And that's, like I said, that's for people who were churched pre-COVID. So they were in the habit of attending regularly pre-COVID. So those are some generational shifts we will have time for questions later, so if you have any, hold on to them.
So we have also shifted theologically over time. Unitarians and Universalists were Christians. They were Christian heretics, right? So the Unitarian, God is one, and the Universalist, everybody's saved, but still Christian. And so how that shows up then still in our worship services, well, we lit Advent candles this morning, part of the Christian tradition, getting ready for Christmas Eve services, which we have, and where we will tell the story of Jesus because it's Christmas Eve. And we'll also, have a solstice service in a couple of weeks on Sunday, but really drawing on our Christian roots. And the other part of our Christian tradition, I would say, is that strong tradition of doing good in the world, right? And that showed up in lots of different ways throughout our history, some of them great, some of them not as great, but there was this ethic of it's not just about us, it's about doing good in the world. So for a few influences historically, there were the Transcendentalists in the 1800s and early 1900s who brought the teaching that we as humans are inherently driven to connect to something that's beyond us, something that's greater than us, and that there are universal truths that we can know. And so, one of the things that's a bit heretical about that is there are traditions, faith traditions still, that say that people can't have a direct connection to God, that there's an intermediary priest or, faith leader between them. That's not something we've always said, and certainly not something we say now. I'm not getting between you and whoever you're looking for. But that was one of the things that was heretical. But there are universal truths, like the Transcendentalists called it universal brotherhood. I would call that unity and oneness, that there is equality and equity, and that there is the sacred in nature. Many of the Transcendentalists were very connected to nature, and that's something that you all mentioned as part of the Holy for You. And so the other thing that the Transcendentalists did was to question the sacred texts, and to say that, perhaps the bark on a tree is as much a sacred text as what's written in the Bible. Imagine how heretical that was at the time. So they really focused on our own personal spiritual development as a way to change what happens in the world. Is that sounding familiar as well? So then in the mid-20th century, the 1900s, we had the influence of humanism. And that's a focus on this world, not the next world, not another world, but focusing on what's happening right now and what's happening in the natural world. That it's about connection between people, it's about making this world now a better place, as good as it could be. There was more of a focus on reason, kind of getting into our heads again, a belief in science and really focusing on that. And then also acknowledging that there's a purpose for us to be here as humans that's greater than ourselves, and that's in service to humanity. That happened at about the time when small fellowships were being planted in the West. And so many of the fellowships that were started in the West, including the Unitarian Fellowship of Olympia, had a very humanist focus. They started out as lay-led, without a minister or a spiritual leader. And so there were Sunday morning talks, and there were Sunday morning speakers, and it had a more humanist feel to it. And in some of the things I described, you can probably still hear that humanist influence that we feel today. I would say in probably the past 25 years, we've had another shift toward a more spiritual theology. So acknowledging this world now, our good works, and that there is also the divine, and wanting a spiritual grounding for how we are in the world. So, and really, how I think about and talk about that is what is it that makes this community, OUC community, or any UU community different than a social justice group, the League of Women Voters, or the Southern Poverty Law Center? What makes it different to attend a worship service on Zoom than to watch a TED Talk, right? So what is that thing that makes us different? And I think it's the spiritual element. So we draw from many sources, and all of those parts of our history, there's lots of others, those parts of our history help contribute to where we are today, and we are changing again with the Article 2 Commission and looking to bring a more anti-racism, anti-oppression, multicultural focus. Once again, we're looking at that question of who we are, what do we believe, what are our values, and what do we hold up in worship. And one of the challenges is that our theology has changed a lot and is changing. Our liturgy, which is the order of service and what we do on Sunday morning, that hasn't changed very much at all. And so kind of one of the theological questions is, if we are about connection and about connecting to what's within, what's among, and what's beyond, how could our liturgy best reflect that theology? That's a shift that I reflect on pretty much every week as we're looking to create a worship service, and also recognizing that for many, the comfort of a liturgy that's known is really important. And so it's weighing, what have we been, what could we be, and what reflects our theology now.
And then along came COVID, and there were definitely some shifts there. And the most obvious is that it pushed us onto Zoom, and we're still using Zoom for our multi-platform worship. So hello, folks on Zoom with us right now. So that was the obvious shift. We went on Zoom, we wore masks, things had to change. But I think the shift that I notice that is perhaps a little bit more subtle is that we really turned toward an ethos of mutual care, that we needed to take care of each other. That in fact, the act of gathering together for worship could be dangerous to some amongst us, and that we needed to care for each other as we did worship. And that's, I certainly hope, not going away. We will continue to be a community of care. And part of that is that we have to consider everyone who is wanting to participate and how to safely include. And so offering options, offering care, listening to people's needs, remembering that it's about connection, and part of connection is inclusion, part of connection is acceptance, part of connection is adapting and being adaptable as we learn new things and learn that people have different needs. So these shifts that COVID brought, one thing I notice is that people are more likely to not come if they are sick. That before there was an ethos, if you were in the choir or you were a worship leader, if you had signed up for that week, well, you would darn well show up even if you were sick, right? And now, no, we think about that in a different way. That in fact, there's ways that you could Zoom in from home if you were the celebrant that day and you weren't feeling well, or somebody else could cover for you. And we also, we this week made the decision to take the Thursday evening activities and cancel them because of the likelihood of ice in the parking lot. So again, we're thinking about keeping people safe and being more willing to adapt or do things differently or call in sick or cancel something if that's a way to keep people safe. And I think that's a shift that we'll see moving forward.
So a couple things I would just add, particular to Sunday mornings related to COVID. We know that we welcome people from a larger geographical area because they join us online, and that we have members who are not in Olympia. And, you know, it's always interesting. I don't see it as much now because I'm not online, but hear from the tech team and other members, other folks online, that people join us from all over. And because we're posting our recordings, people watch them later from who knows where, right? So a larger reach. One of the things I've noticed about COVID for myself and for others is that our attention span has shifted. So part of the video culture is that we're used to shorter snippets of things. And so you may have noticed that I'm not doing 20-minute sermons anymore. I'm doing shorter bits with more readings, and it's broken up so that with music so that there's time to take these things in. That's intentional on my part, a reflection of how I know my brain is working these days, and I think probably how others' brains are as well, needing a bit of a break and more time to take things in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's get you the mic, Ann.
And I had a comment from a congregant today that said how much she appreciated that the sermon was broken up and that there were readings interspersed in it. Mm-hmm. And she thought that was a really good change in our service.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great, thank you. So that really was intentional, and I've gotten enough feedback like that. A couple months ago, somebody said, "You're onto something." So, yeah. And it keeps the service moving. It gives us an opportunity to catch up. I talk with Troy about musical interludes for that. We also are intentional about thinking about how do we interact with the folks online. That we put the chat up during the Sharing from the Heart and everybody can see it, and we invite that engagement. There are other platforms where the music would sound better online, but Zoom gives us the opportunity for interaction. And so we've prioritized the interaction over some other things because we have to make choices about that. The other thing I'll mention about Sunday morning is, while some of the topics are topics that ministers talk about all the time, things like grief and mourning and living with change and uncertainty and letting go, those topics have taken on new meaning with COVID, and we approach them differently. So one of the big things, as Sarah mentioned, about COVID is technology and how that's changed. So, as Sarah and I are talking and as we're leading worship, we're speaking to the people in the room. We're also speaking to the camera back there to have an engagement with those who are online. We have a TV in our sanctuary now. And Teresa and Carbon at the tech table were showing us earlier that when they kind of take the camera back and show the whole sanctuary, that we can see the TV on the TV, which is what they're doing right now, right? So there's kind of this infinite loop there. My experience here of the technology is when I arrived as the new minister, there had been a desire to stream services, but it hadn't happened. And so we were just beginning that conversation in my first year, and then COVID came, and we were like, well, I guess we're doing online church now. It was the kick in the pants, if you want to think of it that way. And I will say that multi-platform worship or some kind of streaming is the standard in churches now. It's not something extra or unusual. It's what's expected. And part of that is the generational shift that Sarah mentioned. Folks younger than boomers are looking for the opportunity to be able to worship and join a faith community online. And so that's really something that we have to pay attention to and make sure that we do. One of the other shifts around technology is we have dedicated staff and volunteers. Now, there had always been AV volunteers here for some recording and the soundboard. Now there's a computer and there's streaming, and the sound we're doing differently so that it's the best as it can be in the room and those kinds of things. And we have staff who are dedicated to helping us provide a good multi-platform service. We have choices to make about do we prioritize the online experience or the in-person experience? With the new member ceremony, how do we welcome people who are here? How do we make sure we don't forget anybody online? So there's always just an eternal thinking about making sure we have that engagement. And so when we are planning worship every week, and as we kind of look at the arc of the year and how we approach things, we're taking all of these shifts into consideration, knowing that there's going to be more shifts, that things are going to change, because we are a living tradition, and that's what we do. And so we're also on the lookout for what's the next thing? What's the next thing that we'll need to be paying attention to? Is there anything you would add to that, Sarah? So we want to make sure there's time for questions. And Celia, I see questions or comments. So,
Is there going to be a survey in which people might actually freely express their interest in longer sermons? It's always easy to say, I think it's fabulous, Reverend Mary, that you're breaking it up. But there are people who might say, every once in a while, it would be so nice just to be able to relax into a little more in-depth, a little longer service. But I'm not going to say that to you because it's a negative feedback, and I don't want to have a negative relationship with you.
yeah, sure. Thank you, Celia. In general, I'll just say that just because you disagree with something I might do or say doesn't mean we have a negative relationship. That's just the way of the world. And I appreciate there's a power difference and it might feel that way to you. My intention is to be open to feedback and understand that there are different ways of doing things. I'm certain that with many of the decisions I make, other people would decide something different. And the worship arts team has talked on occasion about, do we do some kind of a survey related to worship? And so that would be an opportunity for that. I think what I'm looking at is sometime this spring, there are a number of questions I think we need to ask about Sunday mornings. The after-service events, assuming we go to 2 services, does that work with time in between? How are the services working? Those kinds of things. I don't know if you've noticed, but one of the other changes I made this last few weeks, probably about 6 weeks now, is there's no announcements in the service anymore. Some people like it, some people don't. So just a little bit of feedback for how is this for you, and are there things you're missing or things that you would like to make sure we continue?
First of all, I want to thank you and Reverend Sarah and the worship arts team for the deep thought and care that you give to the services. I really understand what you're saying, and I think that it probably would be good to, like, mixing it up. I, for one, really like the way it's broken up. Today, because now it's been a few weeks and it finally occurred to me, okay, this is how we're doing things now. And I realized I don't feel like I'm being preached at. I felt like each part was a prayer. And I really like that. But I can see that there are on occasions might be a need for a longer, topic. And just one other thing about the technology, you mentioned the younger generation. I'm thinking of like Nancy May in particular. The older, she so values the Zoom, and I'm sure she's not the only one. She's the one that I know of. So, it's valuable to other generations too. So, but again, thank you.
And, I tell the story of the first time we experienced someone joining our service from their hospital bed. I was sold. Because, this was a person who was in need of their faith community, and we were there for them online. I'm good. Carbon, were you waving to us? Uh-huh.
What is being, for the kids that are being born right now, I've heard Gen Alpha, but I'm hoping that's going to not stick. So,
And Gen COVID might be the,
yeah.
to change their lives. Yeah.
There will not be a test. There will not be a test. Yeah, and of course, that generational theory and generational assignments, a 20-year spread, in reality, not everybody in a generational cohort is going to be exactly the same. It's just a generalization.
Well, in addition to the, community experience the generations have, there's also often a developmental choice about how much and how involved you're going to be in church at a particular age in your development. And oftentimes, obviously, when people have near school-age children, they're more interested than when they're not raising school-age children. At least that's historically been true. I'm not saying it will be true, but I think we need to keep that in mind.
Oh, for sure. There's stages of life in addition to generational cohorts. Interestingly, people talk about that younger generations are attending church less. One that I just read recently said actually, as a percentage for the age that they're in, that millennials are attending church at a greater percentage for their age than boomers were when they were that age. So it's like more complicated. Yeah.
And it also has to do with spiritual development, not just age, but spiritual development and engagement as well. I was thinking as Sarah was talking, so I've been leading new member gatherings for about 7-8 years now, and just the shift in that period of time. Before, people would say, well, I was raised Methodist, Presbyterian, Catholic, and so that means that they have some sense of what a minister does and kind of how to be in a community. Now it's more like, I don't know how to address you. What can I ask of you as my minister? I'm not sure what this relationship is, and what's this pledging thing, and just not knowing about being in a church community at all, and that's really a big change. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity for people to ask those questions. Jasper?
So I can certainly appreciate the availability of online services, just like you said, someone who can't get here because they're ill, or people with children, or transportation, or whatever. But I also wonder if over time there will be some evaluation as far as what we would call, in some circles, outcomes for people who aren't attending in person. Like, what are they getting, and are they getting what we as a community want? Do you know what I mean? Is that, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Measuring outcomes, if you will, of spiritual development is a hard thing. How do we do that ever, particularly online? Sarah and I talk about what I would call engagement pretty much every week when we meet, and that's really about how do we keep everyone engaged, including folks who do participate in our community online, and what does that mean for them. So I will also say, I'm in relationship with one of my colleagues here in Olympia in a different denomination, and she does not do online worship and does not do online events because her belief is that people need to come to church. And that's a valid way to run a congregation. We'll see, so we'll see.
Did we have an online? I saw it coming up in a note. Okay. So Alex gives us a note that generational name has to do with technology. Boomers are pre-computer. Gen X, cross-section, are the ones that remember pre-computer, but were still largely raised with it. And then millennials were born and raised with tech. And so that might be a way to remember the differences in generations.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering if people who participate online for the Sunday worship are participating in person for small groups and other activities?
So we don't necessarily know. This is one of those questions of tracking engagement. We don't necessarily know how everyone is participating in every way. What we can tell are when people register for events, when people are a part of a small group, many of those are still online as well. So you could be participating in online worship and in an online study and action circle where you're forming long-term relationships with others in that circle and are part of that. You could be on some committees, and the committee meetings are primarily online. So there's actually a lot of ways that people are engaged online. We also could have people who are attending online on Sunday and are coming to in-person events at other times, because we don't track everything that everyone does with precision. It's hard to say for sure.
And I can share just a little bit. It's very dependent on the group. The worship arts team has been meeting in person for about a year now. The pastoral care team meets in person in the summer and goes online for the winter when it's dark and rainy. The board meets online all the time. And so it just depends, and it gives another layer of decision making, but also of possibility for engagement.
And we have a note from Rich on Zoom saying, I am on the board of trustees and participate exclusively online. So there's an example of deep engagement and online participation. Thank you, Rich. Yeah, Aurora.
Just getting back to the idea of worship, I really appreciated what you said about the roots of worship, meaning holding up what we value and whatever. And I'm just wondering, thought came to me now, because there is that confusion around that word and what are we worshiping, and also I think a lot of people, when we mention we go to church, a lot of people get turned off about the idea of worshiping because they naturally think of a deity, worshiping. Has there ever been thought, or do you think there'll ever be thought of just not using that term and coming up with Sunday gathering, Sunday community, something different, just to not have that confusion? Or is that like pushing things too far?
Well, for sure. That's a great question, Aurora. And I tend to be in the camp with Bill Sinkford, who was the president of the UUA, and saying that there is a language of spirituality. And I think rather than replacing those words, that we claim those words and we redefine them. I think about it the same way that my husband, who's a veteran, thinks about the flag. So he's a progressive person who served in the military. The flag is his as well. It doesn't belong to conservatives. And so it's not replacing the thing, it's claiming it and redefining it and making it ours. So that's how I tend to approach it. So I'm going to continue to use worship. There are groups that might use other terms, but I saw a head shaking behind you too at that suggestion. So, yeah. Right.
Back in October 10th or something year, anyway, you did answered questions from the congregation, and one of the questions was, what do you mean by worship? And the answer was about considering things of worth. And just to quickly take the story a little farther, I sent the link to my grandson who is trekking in Nepal right now, and anyway, he says, that's amazing, things of worth, huh? And so you never know where your message may travel to.
You got it, sir.
Reverend Mayor, when you said claiming the words, it brought to mind a comment attributed to Sophia Loren when it was her 80th birthday, and a reporter interviewing her said, "Why, Miss Loren, you don't look 80." And she said, "Darling, this is what 80 looks like."
So this is what worship looks like. Thank you, Arlene. That's wonderful. Any other questions here? Oh, online.
So Woody online points out that for whatever it's worth, there are currently 12 people online, and I count 11 in the sanctuary. Yeah, so we're at about 50-50. Awesome.
And our services have been, they were at about 50-50 for quite a while. We've tipped now to more people in person than online. I'm guessing it might have shifted today, though, because there's snow. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. 81, yeah, and there weren't 81 people
Yeah.
here in person, so.
So another comment in the chat from Alex, that the terminology can be triggering for those with a history of religious abuse. And yes, absolutely. When we talk about reclaiming words, we also are a community where there are people with a variety of histories, and those words are going to carry those histories as well. And we also are a community where there are people here who have suffered various forms of religious trauma in the past. We gather sometimes a class together that I've led many times called Owning Your Religious Past, and I've seen how people have many, many experiences to unpack. And that is part of what we're doing here when we reclaim those words. We also need to unpack, what does that mean for a person who's had a certain kind of experience? When Reverend Mary talked about reclaiming the flag, I have that debate in my household all the time too. And it's different if you feel that that flag has harmed you as well,
Yep.
right? So we're always in this conversation, for sure. For sure.
Are there other questions online or in person? And then we'll finish up here. Sarah has a youth group to go to.
This question or comment may be tabled for another discussion, but before I became involved in UU, I heard the term a fellowship of seekers, and I always liked it. But since I've become involved with UU, I haven't heard it. I wonder what happened to it.
I've heard it recently, I think, Frank. Yeah. It could just be one of those things that fashions come and go. But yeah, a fellowship of seekers, the idea that we are seekers. And it's going to be interesting with Article 2, if that is adopted. And we don't have the language of the 7 principles. Not that we will ever be told that we can't ever go back to the language of the 7 principles. We can always pull it out. But it'll just be interesting to see what terms of self-description we start to use to describe ourselves. I think Fellowship of Seekers is still a lovely way to describe what we are here. It does, yeah. Yeah, saying that it goes back to the Transcendentalists and it has some historical relevancy there for us as well.
And I would add that the term fellowship has a particular meaning in Unitarian Universalist history that tends to denote a small lay-led congregation. And so there's a little bit of a challenge with that, particularly in a congregation like this that has a fellowship history. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that's what the Transcendentalists did. So this is I'm sorry, Sarah, was there something else you wanted? Okay, this is an ongoing conversation for sure. We didn't talk about, why do we have a prayer and why do we share and, all those kinds of things. So we'll certainly do this again. And of course, if you want to be in conversation at all, please reach out to Sarah, please reach out to me. We do appreciate hearing how things are going for you. You can reach us on email or phone or, grab us after a service.
And our contacts are up there right
yes.
now on the slide. So you can contact, for worship arts team and service ideas, reach out to Reverend Mary, minister@ouc.org. Not any of those other scam, fake emails that float around.
Yeah.
minister@ouuc.org. If you have thoughts about storytelling or hospitality, it's not just what happens in the sanctuary or online. We also have folks who volunteer for hospitality in person and for tech. So if you are a person who could volunteer to help, please do reach out. You can reach out to me for hospitality and welcome in person, and Teresa at the tech team for helping with the online or tech team experience. And for music and choir, reach out to our wonderful music director, Troy.
So are we ready to extinguish our
We are.
chalice? Because you know it's what we do here. So these words are adapted from Alice Anacheka Nessman. In a time of uncertainty, when everything around us is changing constantly, each day new developments, when the world we live in suddenly seems upside down and topsy-turvy, we light our chalice to remind ourselves of our grounding in our faith. We remember that the flaming chalice came into being as a beacon of hope during World War II, a secret symbol that offered help and refuge. In the midst of it all, we wrap ourselves in the warm light of the familiar flame, a reminder of the strength that emerges when we come together in community. As we extinguish the chalice, may we carry its light with us. Thank you all for gathering today. We appreciate your engagement and your questions.